The National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations continued its conference on U.S. foreign policy and the Arab world today in Washington, D.C. Here, panelists discuss the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and how it affects U.S. policy in the region. It's an hour and 40 minutes.
Please take your seats, because this session is as important as any of them. It goes without saying that the issues surrounding the question of Palestine lie at the core of American credibility in the region and American capabilities in the region. It is also beyond question that this particular challenge is the oldest one that has bedeviled America maximizing its policy-related goals in the region. It's the most massive one. It is also the most pervasive one, from Morocco to Muscat, Baghdad to Berbera, Algiers to Aden, and Aleppo in between. To chair this session, we have William Corcoran, who's the president of American Near East Refugee Aid, which is one of the more established and largest of the voluntary, non-governmental, non-profit organizations helping the people in the Palestinian occupied territories and doing relief and humanitarian and development work in Jordan and Lebanon as well. William Corcoran.
Thank you, John Duke. I trust you've had enough coffee this morning, but we're going to stimulate you further with this topic and also with the erudition and eloquence of our speakers. We do have one change to your list of speakers today. Unfortunately, Mr. Daniel Levy is not able to attend, and so in his place we've been very fortunate to secure the wisdom of Barbara Lubin. Barbara is the Executive Director of the Middle East Children's Alliance based in Berkeley, California. I'd like to make one other note to the bios. The bios are quite detailed and I think sufficient for you to study them on your own. But we have one change in the bio of Mr. Andrew Whitley, and that is that soon he will be finishing his career with UNRWA, and he's moving on to a fascinating future as the Policy and Advocacy Director of the Elders based in London. So we wish him good luck in this endeavor. I would ask the commentators, His Excellency Ambassador Shukri, and also we're expecting any moment now Ambassador Edicott of the PLO to interject themselves actively in this, create a lively conversation for us, and engage us in their backgrounds so that we have more depth in this whole illustration. One side note, maybe set in context right now. I just came back 2 days ago from Palestine, seeing our offices throughout West Bank and Gaza. And in the conversations with various officials and also with our staff there, I came away with a foreboding sense of anxiety among people. Anxiety, not the peace process. To many of them, this is a non-event. Their anxiety is to what follows in the intervening months. As you drive along the Jericho-Jerusalem road, you see bridges are being built across that road now, which would then anticipate highways traversing the West Bank in places they had never been before. It raises questions. The other questions are involved in, for instance, in terms of what happens after the midterm election here. Will that be sending a signal to, for instance, right-wing politicians or settlers in Israel that they now have a new freedom because the political clout of this administration is less than it was prior to the election? These are all questions they're raising, and this would serve as a context from which I would ask our speakers to address you. And we will begin first with Ms. Kathy Christensen, and I would ask her to please either stay comfortable either at your seat or at the podium, your choice.
Good morning. When Benjamin Netanyahu, then out of office, was caught on video talking back in 2001 to a family of settlers in the West Bank, he boasted about having undermined the Oslo peace agreement when he was prime minister in the mid-1990s. And speaking about the United States, he said, quote, "I know what America is. America is a thing you can move very easily, move in the right direction," unquote. I would have to say that this little truism uttered by Netanyahu has never been more accurate than it is today. The so-called peace process in which President Obama is currently mired is, of course, only the latest of a multitude of U.S. attempts to ignite the search for a peace agreement between Palestinians and Israelis over the last several decades. And it has to be said that each attempt is a little more hopeless, and each time the United States is a little more blind to why it is hopeless. The hard reality, I think, is that because of that blindness, it is the United States itself that is blocking any possibility of reaching a just, equitable, and lasting peace. The United States itself is ultimately the party that is impeding the search for justice and equity in Palestine, Israel. There has been, and there still is to a considerable degree, a disturbing amount of enthusiasm for this current round of talks from what I would describe as those who have an investment of reputation in the two-state solution. This includes, first and foremost, policymakers from the Obama administration, as well as many former policymakers from the Clinton administration, moderate Zionists such as the relatively new pro-Israel lobby group J Street, and a great many commentators in the mainstream media. The danger in this push for a two-state solution, and in the fact that these people have invested their reputation in its achievement, is that they are pursuing it for the wrong reasons. Because it is politically expedient, or to save Israel from the demographic problems of a too high Palestinian population growth, or simply because this is what they've staked their reputations on. And they fail or deliberately refuse to recognize the substantial obstacles to the actual realization of a peace agreement that will result in a real, viable Palestinian state. They don't examine the realities on the ground that stand in the way of sovereignty for the Palestinians. They refuse to see that Israel, whether under Netanyahu or under any other conceivable Israeli government, will never agree to genuine Palestinian independence or to ending the occupation. They don't, in fact, generally even acknowledge that there is an occupation, that one party to the negotiations occupies and totally controls the other, and therefore that the two parties are in no way equal or equally able to press their demands for a peace agreement. This is a road to disaster, meaning most likely disaster for the Palestinians. These two-state enthusiasts are locked into this particular solution no matter what. No matter that Israel continues to devour the territory where the small Palestinian state would be located, no matter that the negotiations and the proposed solution ignore Gaza, where over one-third of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories lives, no matter that the United States arms one side in the negotiation and enables its territorial advances and all of its oppressive policies. This is really the crux of the issue, because the United States gives Israel at least $3 billion in military aid every year, and usually more, as part of a 10-year, $30 billion arms package agreed to by the Bush administration, and because the U.S. and Israel are in so many ways geopolitical partners. The United States is, in fact, an interested party on one side of peace negotiations rather than a neutral mediator or an honest broker. U.S. military aid and the fact that it is essentially a signed and sealed commitment running through the year 2017 removes virtually any leverage that the United States might have to induce Israel to make concessions. The U.S. is powerless to cajole or force Israel to move. I think we've seen how this works in reality throughout the dispute over Israeli settlements and the so-called settlement freeze. The United States demanded, Israel made a show of complying but did not. Obama covered for the Israelis, telling them that they were making unprecedented concessions. And then when we wanted an extension of the freeze, Israel said flatly no. And so instead of exerting pressure on the Israelis, or even objecting, we have offered them more aid and more concessions. Israel is never held accountable, always rewarded. Which raises another critical effect of this U.S.-Israeli partnership, the glaring power imbalance at work in negotiations and in all other aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli situation. This partnership places an almost totally powerless people, the Palestinians, on one side of the negotiating table, opposite their very powerful occupier and the occupier's arms provider. The power imbalance dramatically skews not only the relative strength of the parties, but the very terms they are negotiating. The Palestinians have already recognized Israel's existence inside its 1967 borders, constituting 78% of Palestine. And it should be clear, actually, that even Hamas is willing to agree to a long-term truce with Israel and live with a two-state situation if Israel were to move back inside its own borders and withdraw from the occupied territories. The Palestinians are now being asked to negotiate over the remaining 22% of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But Israel is determined to retain the large settlement blocks inside that 22%, as well as large additional areas inside that territory. And it has the military power and the U.S. support necessary to impose its demands on the disposition of territory. If the Palestinians gain a state, quote unquote, at the end of this process, it will be a state in name only, little more than a disconnected set of tiny enclaves with no real sovereignty or independence or viability, and without Gaza, which will be left to drift. A state in pieces. I think it's vital that we recognize that this totally unacceptable outcome, which is probably the best that can be expected, will be the responsibility of those two-state enthusiasts, including inside the Obama administration, who are ignoring the grim realities that stand in the way of a solution. The noted Israeli historian Avi Shlaim recently made an important point about the power imbalance in an article in the London Guardian. The prospects for reaching a permanent status agreement are poor, he said, quote, because the Israelis are too strong, the Palestinians are too weak, and the American mediators are utterly ineffectual. The sheer asymmetry of power between the two parties militates against a voluntary agreement, like putting a lion and a lamb in a cage and asking them to sort out their own differences. In order to bridge the huge gap, this is still Shlaim talking, the huge gap separating the two sides, America must first redress the balance of power by putting most of its weight on the side of the weaker party, unquote. I would guess we are nowhere near the day when the United States is prepared to put most of its weight on the side of the weaker party in this conflict. And so we come to the reasons for the identity of interests that binds the United States to Israel and prevents any meaningful U.S. pressure on Israel. I happen to be an advocate of the school of thought that holds that the pro-Israel lobby plays a vitally important role in determining the direction of policy in the Middle East, particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that the lobby cements the U.S.-Israeli